Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Eric Patterson. I serve as the Executive Vice President of the Religious Freedom Institute. And on behalf of all of us here and our President, Tom Farr, welcome. We're delighted you could join us. The mission of the Religious Freedom Institute is to achieve broad acceptance of religious liberty as the cornerstone of successful societies, as a fundamental human right, and as a source of national and international security. And we do that in a variety of ways, through training programs for government officials, through research, through education for high school and college students, and through advancing new scholarship. And today, that's exactly what we're going to do. In a few moments, you'll get an advanced peek at the topic of a book by one of our senior scholars. Let me just say a little bit about our format for today. We'll hear the presentation by Dr. Fox, and then there'll be a time, 15 to 25 minutes of Q&A. And when we get to that point, he will recognize you, and if you would very succinctly state who you are and your affiliation, and then a brief question rather than a long statement. A brief question, and that will allow many people to be able to participate. Well, Jonathan Fox is the Yehuda Avner Professor of Religion and Politics. He's the director of the Religion and State Project, and he's a senior research fellow at Bar Ilan's Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. And you can see here from the slide his affiliation there at Bar Ilan University. He's an expert on the intersection of religion and politics, both domestically and internationally. And the Religion and State database is a well-known resource for scholars on a variety of indicators measuring different religious trends as well as accompanying political trends. One of the ways to measure the impact of a scholar is by the support they receive and by the recognition of their peers. He's received major foundation funding from the John Templeton Foundation, from the German Israel Foundation, and from the Israeli Science Foundation. Similarly, he's been recognized with awards by his peers for outstanding scholarship from the International Studies Association and for the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Most importantly to us, he's a senior fellow involved with our FORIS project. FORIS stands for Freedom of Religious Institutions in Society, a multi-year Templeton-funded grant that looks at the freedom of religious institutions, not just individuals, but communities and religious institutions. It's a multi-year, multi-country project. Well, to talk about his new book, Thou Shalt Have No Other Gods, before me, please help me welcome Jonathan Fox.
Thanks to everybody for coming. It's a full house. I'm flattered. The book has a provocative title. We could say I went biblical on it. So I'll just cut right into the presentation. I just want to state in advance, when I discuss why governments discriminate against religious minorities, there are a lot of moving parts to this argument because it is not a simple process. There are a lot of factors, and the interrelation between them is very complicated, and I'm going to be able to touch on that to some extent here, but I couldn't possibly get into the full level of complexity in a 20-minute talk, but I'm going to try and cover some of the major points. So we're going to start with a very seemingly simple question: why do governments discriminate against religious minorities? And we're going to start making it more complicated because it's really two questions. The first is, which governments are more likely to discriminate? And second, against whom are they more likely to discriminate? Because one of the findings that I found in much of my research in this book and earlier research is governments that discriminate tend to discriminate unequally. That means some minorities get it worse or differently than others. It makes sense when you say it, but not a lot of people have been paying attention to it. So I'm going to start with a definition. This is my official definition for government religious discrimination, which I abbreviate to GRD because you'd be surprised how many pages you can cut out of a book by doing that. Because this is a term that comes up so much. It's a ridiculous number. I probably cut 3-4 pages out of the book just by doing this. But it's restrictions placed by governments or their agents on religious practices or institutions of religious minorities that are not placed on the majority religion. So this is stuff that's done specifically to minorities and not the majority. If it's done to everybody, that is not discrimination, because to discriminate means to treat differently. It's repression. I'm not saying it's good, but it is not what I'm talking about here. I do have in other parts of the data set measures for that, but that's not something I'm really addressing in this talk, and I don't really address it in this book. So government-based religious discrimination, in this study I have 35 types that I look at. This is a list of 35 things a government might do to restrict a religious minority. I found no way to squeeze them all on the screen in any comprehensible manner, but you can divide them into 4 categories. Restrictions on religious practices, of which there are 12 types I measure. On religious institutions and clergy, there are 8 types, and that's of particular interest to the FORIS project. And not here, but in other forums, I'm going to be comparing these categories to see how the institutional is related to other aspects, and I think that'll be very interesting. I haven't started that yet, so I don't have any answers. Restrictions on conversion and proselytizing, 6 types, and of course, in the social sciences, our favorite category, other, which is everything that doesn't fit into the other categories. So this is a comprehensive study. It includes 183 countries. That is all countries with a population of 250,000 people and a few smaller countries. 771 religious minorities, which is all minorities which meet a 0.2% population cutoff in the country. They are all different religions from the majority religion, or in many cases different denominations of the same religion, say Orthodox Christians in a Catholic country, Shi'i Muslims in a Sunni Muslim country. And this is a very comprehensive list. It's possible I missed a few here and there, but this is pretty much all religious minorities in pretty much all countries. This is not a sample. This is what we like to call the universe of analysis. So technically, statistical significance is not relevant, but my colleagues make me do it anyway. So here's some basic findings. I have here the big black line is the overall score, and the other lines are for the various categories. The key thing is they're all going up worldwide. And this is not driven by any particular region of the world. It's not driven by Christian countries or Muslim majority countries or Buddhist majority countries in particular. This is a robust trend. All types of minorities in all types of countries, discrimination has been going up over time. So that's the first finding, not very good for our religious freedom in the world. Now this is what I earlier said. This is more details on how countries discriminate unequally. Of the 83 countries, 150 discriminate unequally. When you eliminate the few countries that don't discriminate and the countries that only have one minority, that's the vast majority of them. And I have here a list on the bottom of the countries that don't discriminate. If you look at that, you might notice this is not the list of countries. Burkina Faso, Benin, Burundi, Cameroon. These are bastions of religious freedom. There's only one Western democracy on this list. It is not the U.S. It is our northern neighbor, Canada. Only one that does not do any of the things I look at to its religious minorities. So the world is not as we think it might be, just on this very basic cursory look, and I'm going to be getting into why. The causes of religious discrimination are very complex. There are multiple and cross-cutting influences. Any finding I tell you, if I say democracies discriminate less, this is qualified by all other things being equal. And in the case of democracies, all other things are not equal to the extent that even though I can statistically show if you're a democracy, you're less likely to discriminate, Western democracies discriminate a hell of a lot because there are other factors pushing against the democratic influence. And there are also significant differences across groupings of states. I had to divide the world into 7 different groupings of states to really figure out what was going on. That's a bit too complicated to get into here, but the fact is what's going on in Western democracies is that are not Orthodox majority, is different from the Orthodox majority states, is different from the Muslim states, is different from the Buddhist states, and so on. the patterns are similar, but they manifest very differently. I get into that in the book, but that's a 2-hour talk, not a 20-minute talk. I apologize. It's just very complicated. So we'll start with which countries discriminate more, which is a similar questions. Well, the first and most powerful finding is states that are neutral on religion discriminate the least. But what does neutral mean? It doesn't necessarily mean you're secular. States that have a secular ideology actually tend to be anti-religious, and that surprisingly leads to more discrimination. Neutral really means the state just stays more out of religion and tries to treat everybody equally, which is obviously going to cause you to discriminate less. But there's a difference between neutrality and secularism, even though some definitions of secularism include neutrality. So it's a little complicated, but that's consistent across all groupings of countries, although you don't see it in all of them because some of them have no neutral states. But where you have neutral states, you do see that finding. So here's the relationship between hostility to religion and state support for religion. Here are the hostile countries, a lot of discrimination. Neutral countries, there is some, but not much, and it goes up as the states are more connected to religion, and the red bar is just the world average to give you an idea of how these things measure up on the scale. So there is a real relationship going on here, and it's very robust. It doesn't matter how you break it up. This is one of the key factors on who discriminates more or who discriminates less. Countries which are hostile to discrimination discriminate more. Now, these countries all have a history of secular ideology such as communism. You have former communist states, current communist states, or at least states that call themselves communist, and countries with very, very clear secular ideologies. So the hostility almost all seems to be coming from secularism. The other countries which discriminate a lot like one religion, but they don't like others. But here's an interesting question. Why religious discrimination? If you'll recall, my definition of religious discrimination is restrictions on the minorities that are not placed on the majority. Shouldn't these secular states be hostile to all religion, not just minorities? Well, I do have an answer for that. I don't think they're discriminating against these minorities specifically because of secularism. I think there are other reasons that they are discriminating, but once the discrimination starts, the secular ideology acts as a force multiplier. In a bad way, obviously. So that's what I believe is going on. This is not something I can prove statistically, but it's the only explanation that makes sense to me. If somebody can suggest something better, I'm certainly open to thoughts on that. But I've discussed this with a lot of people, and nobody has a better idea. So I'm going to go with this until we get a better idea. Technically, democracies discriminate less, as I said, but democracy is overshadowed by other factors. Like I said, there's a statistical relationship where all other things being equal, democracies discriminate less, but all other things are not equal. There are other motives, and I'm going to be discussing the various motives for discrimination against minorities, almost all of which apply in at least some democracies, including the secularism thing. And I'll get into that a little bit. Now, which countries discriminate more? Here's another one. Looking at non-Orthodox Christian majority states. I pull out the Orthodox majority states because they have their own pattern of behavior, which is very distinct. Democracies in the developing world discriminate far less than those in the North, the Western democracies and former Soviet democracies that are not Orthodox majority. Interestingly enough, among Christian majority states, developing world non-democracies discriminate about the same level as the democracies in those regions. So you have autocracies that have far more religious freedom on average than you find in the West. What is going on? That's really interesting. That was a very cool finding. The Orthodox majority states discriminate a lot. Doesn't seem to matter whether they're democracies or not. I have some thoughts on that, but I'm not getting into that here. So why is this happening? Well, other factors are overshadowing democracy. We have a few, and I can prove all of these statistically. Richer countries discriminate more. I argue that this is because Discrimination, as my colleague Tony Gill likes to say, costs money. It's not free. Governments have to spend money to discriminate. Richer countries have more. They can afford discrimination. It's a luxury. Societal religious discrimination is a cause of government-based discrimination. The relationship is actually quite complex. I don't want to get into that too much right now, but there is more societal religious discrimination in Western countries than there is in the global South. Developing world countries are also more likely to have neutral religion policies. There are far more of those countries that are neutral on the issue of religion than you find in the West. And I also believe there's an influence of secular ideologies, which is more prominent in the West. And all of that adds together to overshadow the influence of democracy. So democracy does push it down, but these other things are pushing it up harder. That's my explanation. So majority religion and world region actually predict discrimination better than democracy. This is a listing of my groupings of countries, and putting the countries into these groupings actually provides a better guide of what the country is likely to be doing than looking at democracy. So democracy is a factor, but it's not nearly as powerful as people might think it is, and neither is apparently Western liberalism. Why do the states target certain religious minorities? Well, we'll start with objectionable practices. The minority is doing something that annoys the majority. Now, I'm giving you 3 examples up here of things that very much annoy certain secular elements within the West. Infant circumcision. There's movements in a number of countries against it, and it's actually restricted, not banned, but restricted in 3 Western countries, all Nordic countries. Ritual slaughter, kosher slaughter, halal slaughter is banned in a larger number of countries. Many animal rights activists feel it's cruel, you should stun them. The rabbis and imams say you can't do that and have it be kosher and halal. And for that reason, in a number of countries, it is banned. They can import kosher meat, but they may not slaughter it. Women's head coverings, which is actually theoretically an issue for Orthodox Jewish women who do cover their hair. They just tend to do so in a manner that's less conspicuous. I haven't seen much against this, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's something that crops up in the next 5-10 years due to various trends. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but I think it's going in that direction. These are all things that certain secular elements feel should not be happening, but they're religious practices that are integral to the beliefs of the people who believe them, and that results in restrictions. So this is some of my evidence also that secular ideologies are driving it. And these 3 types of laws actually explain about 30% of the difference between the West and the Christian countries in the non-West, because these are not present at all in the non-West. You only find these in Western countries. So I think I have something. Here are some other reasons that I found in many cases. Minorities that are seen as non-indigenous are more likely to attract discrimination. Minorities seen as cults. Nobody can tell you what a cult is, but everybody knows it when they see it, to quote Justice Potter Stewart, who was talking about something not quite as religious. Now, past conflict, perception of threat, could be political, could be security. That gets into a whole literature called the securitization literature, which I can wax poetic about for about an hour and a half, but I'm not going to. And of course, anti-Semitism, I believe, are all factors, and I have evidence for all of this in the book. Getting back to societal religious discrimination, the theory is when society hates a minority, this is going to prompt more action by government officials. That is actually not always the case. I was very surprised to find this out. It turns out it only happens for some minorities but not others. For instance, in the West, this applies to Muslims. It does not apply to Jews. There's no connection between societal discrimination against Jews and what the governments do, but there's a very big connection for Muslims. So I've looked at the various minorities out there where this is happening in various regions in the world, and I am arguing, I can't prove this, but I am arguing that there's a perception of some sort of existential threat, and once that exists, it triggers the relationship. I've listed the regions of the world and the minorities where I think this is happening, but this is The statistical finding is there. The explanation is my theory to explain it. I'm not even sure how to go about proving whether I'm correct or not, but it's a plausible explanation. So I'm going to finish off with some policy implications. Since this is DC, let's talk policy a little bit. Promoting democracy will not necessarily increase religious freedom. It won't hurt, but I don't know how much at all. Societal prejudices play a role, but it only becomes important when minorities are perceived as an existential threat, which actually makes things easier. You don't have to worry about all prejudice. You have to worry about when people are actually projecting a minority as some sort of existential threat and head that one off at the pass, and you can actually do some good, so you know where to focus your energy. Any official ideology, whether it be religious or secular, increases religious discrimination. So practical neutral governments are more beneficial than any ideology of any kind I'm aware of. And also I would like to point out, if the US wants to promote religious freedom, it might want to get its own house in order. And I'm going to stop there. This is what the book's going to look like when it comes out. I believe we have some flyers where you can order it, and I prevailed on Cambridge to get you a 20% discount code, which is good for another 7-8 months if you want to use it. If you order from Amazon, you're on your own. Okay, 20 minutes. Okay, so I'm happy to take questions. There's a lot. I threw a lot at you. Or we can. Oh, great.
Ismail Royer, RFI. How were you able to distinguish between? Some people argue, for example, that the situation of the Rohingya is more ethnic than it is religious, or at least that there's, it's somewhat hard to disentangle. Whether or not that's accurate or not, how were you able to quantify that?
Well, I don't really quantify whether a group is also an ethnic group. They are a religious minority, so I basically coded the information on them the same way I would for any other religious minority. And since I'm looking at government religion policy, I don't have data on how many of them the government are killing as opposed to other minorities. That's just not something I collect, because this comes out of a project that's on government religion policy, so I'm really focusing on the religious factor. If I were focusing on the more broad issues, I might collect more data. I actually do have a research partner in Germany who's collecting that kind of data for all the religious minorities on the list, and we've got a rough copy of the data together, but we haven't even begun to start analyzing it. That's not going to be the next book. The next book is, I'm not going to go there because you'll get too interested in that one. It's a hot topic. The book, but it'll be the book. That book's ready to go to the press for review. The one after that will actually be getting into those kinds of issues and looking at religion and how it influences conflict. So give me a year or two, I'll have an answer for you.
Thank you.
It's an important question, but there's a limit to what you can do in one book, and I will argue I bit off about as much as I can chew on this one.
I'm Scott Seaton. I'm a pastor at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in Arlington, Virginia. So when you mentioned that the United States was left off of your list of countries that do not discriminate,
yeah, that's correct.
It begs the question: what is the reason? What are the reasons behind it?
Okay, it's not very high levels of discrimination, and it's actually coming more from local governments than the national governments. You have a lot of communities, for example, that are blocking Muslims from building mosques, getting building permits to get mosques, things like that. That's actually very common in Western democracies. The number of Western democracies where that happens is very high, and it's almost always local governments doing it, not national governments. The only real exception is the Swiss minaret referendum. And a few other things like that. It's relatively low-level stuff, but the U.S. is not at zero. It's on the lower end, but it's not zero. There might be one or two other things. I'm just not remembering them offhand. Okay, I think I saw a question over there.
Hi, Sue Taylor. I'm with the National Affairs Office of the Church of Scientology. Just a quick question: were you able to take a look at what I call the fear factor in different governments? For instance, government fearing that they're going to be losing control over this new religion, minority religion, that sort of thing.
I didn't look at that specifically. I do have a few variables on whether the government considers the religion a dangerous cult, and that's an important one. And I actually have a graduate student who recently completed her dissertation based on an earlier version of the data where she collected data in Western countries and European countries on additional minorities that are much more. So for each of these countries, she included Mormons, Unification Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Scientologists, and tracked trends on that. And unsurprisingly, the trends across those four groups were actually very similar across countries, and levels of discrimination were much higher. Before you ask for a copy of that, you're welcome to it, but she wrote it in Hebrew. Okay, it is what it is. That is the language of instruction where I work. So she just completed her PhD ceremony was last June. So I hope that answers your question. Yes?
Okay, so on your slide about the factors that increase discrimination against minorities, the last one was anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Is there a reason that you could find why anti-Semitism as opposed to any other religion would stand out?
Well, one of the findings in this book that I just couldn't get into because I didn't have the space is the patterns of discrimination against Jews are actually very different than the patterns against other minorities. And that's actually the topic of the next book, which I'm loath to say this because we're going to go off on a big tangent on a book I don't want to talk about yet, but that's going to be called either Why Do People Discriminate Against Jews or Why People Discriminate Against Jews. And I'm not going to tell you the results, but I guarantee you there's enough to tick off absolutely everybody in my findings. So, but I've talked with Tim, and at some point in time, I probably will come here and give a presentation on that, but I'm not quite ready to do that yet. There are a few things I need to hammer out with I have a co-author, Leif Topper, who's an excellent expert on anti-Semitism. That's a whole literature I don't recognize very well. We're hammering a few things out and putting the final touches on it, and I don't like to present these things in public forums until I really have all my I's dotted and my T's crossed. So you'll have to forgive me on that. But that's a teaser for the next book, which might sell better than this one for some reason. The editor at Cambridge, his eyes popped out of his head when I told him I was writing a book on that. He was very excited. Yes?
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk more about what are the most common types of discrimination. I know you looked at quite a few. And
Okay,
then
sure.
If there are any patterns that are more common in certain areas.
Okay, I actually discussed that in the book. I don't have it memorized well, but 1 minute. Give me a second. I'll pull up the table and give you. So I have a whole chapter where I discuss that in the book. I just didn't get into that here. It's a combination of my aging memory and jet lag. So actually, let's go to the Word version. I'm sorry, just give me a minute. I will find it. Okay, I'll give you a few examples. We'll just go down the list. I'm just picking out some ones that are more common. Let's start with religious practices. The most common restriction on religious practices is on the public observance of religion. This would be like, we don't like you holding services, not even in your church or synagogue or mosque, some sort of restriction on that. 33% of countries do that, 18.7% of minorities in the world are influenced by that. Restrictions on religious publications. There are actually several categories. Also, about a third of the countries in the world restrict religious publications by minorities. It affects 20-something% of the minorities. There are actually 3 categories, so I'd have to sort of figure out the overlap and stuff, which I do somewhere in the book. I just don't have that quite memorized. So that gives you an idea on the practices. Let's move on to institutions. Let's talk about that since I'm part of the FORIS project. 51.9% of countries restricting on building, leasing, or repairing places of worship affects 30.6% of minorities in 2014. That's almost a third of minorities, and there's at least one in more than half the countries in the world that cannot have a place of worship, or at least not as many as it wants. There are registration requirements in a lot of countries, and in almost half of them, the majority doesn't have to register, but the minority religions do. In some cases, it's pro forma, no big deal, but in a lot of cases, minorities are not allowed to register, and there are consequences for registration. A very common tactic by even democratic governments that want to restrict a religious minority is they don't allow them to register, and they say, oh, we believe in freedom of religion for all legal religions. They just don't let all religions be legal. Very common tactic. Annie Sarkisian has a really good book where she points that out, the varieties of religious repression. Not an original idea for me, but I have some more detailed numbers than she ever had. So that's some of the fun stuff on the institutional level. On the conversion and proselytizing, over a third of countries restrict proselytizing by permanent residents of the country to members of the majority religion. This is very heavily weighted towards Muslim majority countries and Orthodox Christian countries, but it's found across religions. This affects a bit over 20% of the religious minorities in the world. That's the big one there, and let's talk, and let's go to my favorite category, other. Restrictions on religious schools and education, 23% of countries, 16.9% of minorities. Mandatory education in the majority religion. At least some minority students must take classes in the majority religion. 24.6% of countries, 18.7% of minorities. Not insignificant stuff. Anti-religious propaganda in official or semi-official government publications. 27.3% of countries, but it only affects 8.7% of minorities. That tends to be heavily weighted against cults and other minorities the government, for particular reasons, doesn't like. So does that give you that should give you a better idea of what's going on? It's always easier to go to. I don't have the kind of memory where I can memorize every last one of these tables, and I've got millions of data points. Don't even get me started on memorizing that. So, but the information's in the book, and it's very clearly discussed. I actually have all 35 measures are listed. The majority of them are discussed at least for a paragraph or two to give you an idea of what we're talking about. That just was a little bit, if I started talking about that too much, that would have been the whole talk. And the results are more interesting, but I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yes?
It's a little nitpicky, but I saw they included UK as a country that has laws regarding women's head coverings. To my understanding, I don't think they do have any laws on that.
I can look it up specifically. It's probably a number of local governments or maybe a few public schools. That it's probably something like that. That's what it tends to be in the countries where it's lower level. But if you look at it, you'll probably find it's. If I'm remembering correctly, the restrictions are occurring in government-funded schools. Either faculty and or students. So that would get a coding but low level. That's actually very common in Europe. Yes?
I was wondering how you account for the scale of discrimination within these data points. So you said like it affects certain minorities, but obviously there's going to be different scales. So do you take that into account with your measurement?
Yes, I do. Each one of the 35 is coded on a scale of 0 to 2, 0 being none, 1 being present but not substantial, 2 being substantial. If you try and get more detailed than that on what are, to large extent, this is a whole process where you take things that are happening in the real world and turning them into numbers. So on one hand, you want as much detail as possible, but two, if you get too detailed, you lose your ability to do things in a consistent manner. So I felt a scale of 0 to 2 was as far as I could go in this particular case, because if you start doing it more detailed, two reasonable people are not likely to agree on the correct number, and that causes methodological problems. But we can get a high level on agreement on no, a little bit, a lot. So, and there might be some disagreements between a little bit and a lot, but not as much as you would think. But there's almost no disagreements on no and yes. So then you take that and you add up all 35, and I have a scale that in theory can go up as high as 70. Thank God no minority actually hits 70. A few in Saudi Arabia come not too far from there, but nobody actually hits 70. So that's how we scale it, and we can get levels. So it's I wouldn't say it's the perfect reflection of reality, because certain assumptions go in and there's a certain amount of estimation, but that's the nature of the beast with this type of methodology. It's been applied to a lot of different topics in the social sciences, and this is the accepted way to do it, and everybody who's doing the research understands what they're working with. So I'm very transparent about that. If you don't like it, you're welcome not to, but this is how we do it. I believe I had a question over there.
Yes. Oftentimes, religious groups will say that their beliefs aren't just epistemological, but ontological. That is to say, they go beyond just the scope of the particular theology, but inform their understanding of reality and the way they engage in the world, even outside of the explicitly religious beliefs, such as some ethical systems that, say, countries that are supposedly neutral promote in their schools. So how do you separate that, those second-order effects, those non-explicit effects, these ethical systems and whatnot, in neutral or a-religious countries from explicit minority?
I'm not really sure how I could even go about measuring that. Sometimes we're limited on what we can measure. So the only thing I can do is try and have as complete a list of things I would like to measure, make sure it is possible to measure them, and be clear about what I measured. So if we're talking about things like that, you'd have to give me a more specific example of one of these second-order effects. Could you give me an example of a second-order effect you'd like me to measure? But this would have to be something that, not just something somebody's thinking. It would have to be, I can't measure what people are thinking. It would have to be something somebody does, and I could find out that they do it. And if you give me an example like that, I might be able to give you a better answer.
So you mentioned in some portion of countries, children in schools have to learn about, or in some way have to learn about the majority religion.
Yes.
I'm from Germany, and while we have mandatory religious classes at certain ages in schools there, it probably wouldn't fall into some of these samples because they offer, multiple religious perspectives. However, if your religion is so small that they don't have a teacher who teaches about that, you do go into some sort of mandatory Judeo-Christian ethics class.
Right. That I'm aware of. So you have a number of countries like that I would not classify that as if somebody's. When I say somebody's getting religious education, religion other than their own, I'm not talking about a comparative religion class where we learn what different religions do, or we're taking a class in ethics. I'm talking, you might be sitting in a room while a Catholic priest comes in and gives you the catechism. All right, that would be the type of thing I'm talking about. There are a number of countries in the West where they have religious education schools. I actually have very detailed variables on that policy, which I didn't get into here because it's not exactly a minority issue. I do talk about that in one of my other books, where I look at, do they have religious education? Is it available for all religions for which there's a substantial number of students? Because having a class for when there's only one student, it isn't reasonable to ask a government to do that. And I ask, are students required to take classes in religions other than their own? I also ask who teaches the religious classes. Is it just a normal teacher, or is the person who's teaching the classes appointed by the religious institutions? So I have information on all of that, and that's how I would deal with that particular issue. But for me, that's more of a government policy issue that might have some implications for minorities, the one implication of which I actually do include in this book, but it's a much larger policy, and that's part of the general religion estate data set. So if I'm remembering correctly, I look at that in either my 2008 or 2015 book, and I have like a third of a chapter where I discuss that. So if you want information, I have a full analysis of that, and that policy hasn't changed much over time. So whatever was happening 10 years ago is more or less happening now. Yes?
My name is Dmitry Makharov. I'm actually co-chair of Moscow PSV Group, Human Rights Group in Russia.
Okay.
Thanks a lot for your research. Actually fascinating. My question is, why did you, for this book in particular, decide to focus on discrimination? And would your conclusions differ if you would frame it not under the discrimination framework, but rather say, what are the guarantees that the governments observe or not observe regarding the fundamental right to freedom of religion?
Okay, well, part of it has to do with the structure of the data, and part of it has to do with the history of earlier stuff I published. I have a book that came out in 2015 called Political Secularism, Religion and the State, which was a much broader analysis of government religion policy, which I don't like talking about religious freedom specifically, although I have a whole chapter where I discuss where nobody agrees what religious freedom actually means. And I discuss 7 or 8 different conceptions of it and proved it's actually not possible to observe all conceptions of religious freedom at the same time. It's actually not possible. Don't ask me to get into why. That's a complicated argument where I have to go into each of the definitions and what it each means. But I actually go through that in the book. So that's the first reason, because you say religious freedom. This is, again, a Justice Potter Stewart type of word. Religious freedom is meaningless unless you get more into the specifics, because nobody agrees on what it means. I'm sure everybody understands that in the current U.S. context, but it's broader than just the way it manifests in the U.S. is somewhat unique, but the general problem of not agreeing on what it means is much broader than just the U.S. So, but in that book, I divide religious freedom into 2 empirical categories. One is restricted, what I discussed here, and the second is when how the government regulates religion in general, in a way that would apply to the majority religion also. And the reason I didn't get into in this book is because the last book, which was based on the previous round, I had another 6 years of data and nothing really changed, so I could have written another book going, hey, same thing happened, or I could do something that I hadn't done before, so I decided to go with the thing I hadn't done before. So if you want to see an analysis of that, my 2015 book will have it. I did do an edited volume, which also came out as a special edition of a journal, where I revisited it for one chapter, and some colleagues took versions of the data and did some interesting things with it just to see all the fun things you can compare my data to. Their analyses of this in religion and fascism, religion and terrorism, all sorts of other things they did with the data, and these are all very well-known people within the field. That book came out last year if you want to look at it. It's called The Correlates of Religion and State, but if you want a true answer to your question, I have that all in my 2015 book. And you might want to particularly look at the chapter where I discuss nobody agrees on what religious freedom means, because if that's an important concept to you, you don't really have to agree with the categories I used. You can even disagree with my conclusion, but it might give you a better idea of how you want to conceptualize religious freedom. Because if you're gonna promote a human right of religious freedom, it's probably a good idea to have a clear idea of what you mean by that. And most people, when you actually start getting to the nitty-gritty, haven't really thought about it as much as they. I don't know you, perhaps you have. I don't know, but a lot of people haven't.
Well, I mean, it's a bit easier from a European perspective because at least you have some sort of common legal framework.
Right.
Council of Europe, and you can base yourself on
Yeah,
the jurisprudence of the court. But of course, I mean, it's not universal.
Sometimes it's more important to have a definition and be clear on what it is than which particular definition you pick. This might be one of those cases. In this case, it's possible to pick a definition that's more beneficial to some people politically than others. So again, it's a complicated issue. I suggest you just think about it a bit. If you look at my chapter and you say, doesn't help me at all, that's fine, but it might help you.
But that's 2015.
That's the Political Secularism, Religion and the State. You could get it on Amazon, and it's out in soft cover, so it's much cheaper than this one's going to be. They're going to sell it in hardcover for a year to try and squeeze some money out of you. Then it's going to come out in soft cover and be less expensive. That's the nature of the publishing business. You all know what I'm talking about. I do what I can to help. I'm more interested in getting my ideas out there than like I'm going to make any money on this book. I might get enough to take my wife to a hotel for a weekend if I'm lucky. So which is nice. We'll be happy to do it. But this is I don't make my big money by publishing these books.
Nathan Berkeley with RFI. Not surprisingly, we have a description of what we think religious freedom is on the homepage of our website, so please do explore that. But I have a question about the prior issue of how you determined, or what your working definition of religion is to help to decide what minorities would count under that definition. I'm sure in the 2015 book or in this book, or maybe both, you help to kind of carefully define where the margins are, what constitutes religion in the first place.
The truth is I honestly mostly relied on various sociologist projects that came up with lists of religion in the world. And anything anybody considered I wanted to use as broad a definition as anything any reasonable, reputable academic would consider a religious minority, I tried to include. So the theory is if you're more inclusive and it turns out something shouldn't be included, you just pop it out of the data set, no big deal. If you don't include something that should have been included, you got to do the research again. And that's simply not happening the way these things work. Once you've spent the money and collected your data, what you got is what you got. So it was really more of a practical definition than an academic definition, where I was really relying on the work of people who were far more expert in that than I am. I'm a political scientist. What's a religious minority? What is religion? That's something I'm less equipped to do. So I just sat on the shoulders of giants, so to speak, on that one.
Sure. And then distinguishing discrimination that's directed at ethnic minorities versus religious. You covered this earlier, but could you describe again how you came about distinguishing that when it made sense to do so?
You can be both an ethnic minority and a religious minority at the same time. So if you were a religious minority and these types of discrimination were present, I coded it, and whether you're an ethnic minority or not doesn't change the fact that doesn't change the fact that this is happening. Now, whether a group being an ethnic minority also influences it, that's a complicated question. A lot of my earlier work was on ethnic minorities. I studied with Ted Gurr, who literally wrote the book, actually 2 books, on ethnic minorities, even though some people are stealing his work and calling it their own these days, mostly Norwegians. And I'm happy to name them in public, and I might not use their real middle name. But sorry, I just had to do that. These people were really ticking me off. It's a lot easier to define religion and ethnicity. There are a lot of religious minorities that people say are ethnic minorities, even though the only thing that distinguishes them is religion. There's less agreement on the definition of ethnicity than religion, so I mostly try to avoid the topic because it's sort of like an academic quagmire sinkhole that doesn't benefit me greatly. However, once I've collected this data, if you were to go through the list and say, let's see which ones of these are ethnic minorities and find some way to classify them as ethnic minorities, something I have not done, and then compare whether the ethnic minorities are treated different than the minorities that are not ethnic, that's something that would be feasible, but it's not something I've done. And I'm not going to say it's something I don't plan to do, because I'm sort of in cahoots with a few people at University of Maryland where we might be doing something similar in the future. So you might get an answer then. People like Hannah Bernier and Nil Satana, who I'm sure you must know Hannah. Oh, well, okay. She's right at University of Maryland. She does a lot of interesting ethnic stuff that overlaps with religion. You might want to get over her sometime. I mean, she'll cost you a taxi ride and lunch. It's cheap. Yes, Paul?
Just a question about Canada, because I'm worried that Canada will be unbearably smug if it's singled out as the only Western democracy.
Yeah, that worries me too. Canadians can be annoying enough about how great Canada is. Are there any Canadians in the room? Because it still applies.
I'm an American, but
Okay.
I haven't renounced Canadian stuff.
All right. My wife technically is Canadian too, although she grew up mostly in the U.S.
Okay. So is mine. So Canada gets complicated. You would know the background, but in its constitutional documents, it established both Protestant and Catholic school systems to be funded by the state in Ontario and Quebec. Quebec has now secularized the whole thing, so forget about that. In Ontario, the Protestant schools have now become what Americans would call public schools, pretty secular. but the Catholic schools are still funded.
I know.
Now, I'm wondering why this, and that
Okay.
applies
See,
in
well-
Alberta and so on.
Okay,
Where
so,
other Protestants, where Protestant
Okay.
schools are not.
so this gets into your definition of discrimination. I'm using a definition which is essentially, as long as your rights are not restricted, it's not discrimination. You're talking about discrimination where one group gets privileges that the other does not. So if you're going to use that definition, yes, there's discrimination in Canada. But that's not the effective definition I'm using in this project. So that, again, gets into the whole thing of how do you define religious freedom. So, but you're absolutely correct. Now, that one of the things I actually want to do in the next round is I'm going to be collecting data on preferential treatment. When government supports religion, does it support all religions or just the majority religion or some religions? Do some get it more than others? That's an important question. I don't have the data for that. But should I get the money from the various places I'm doing, that's on the new code sheet, and that's a question I'm going to be getting at. So it's on my radar. Assuming I get the money, ask me again in, say, about 4 or 5 years. And I will actually have I should have a thorough answer for you. Sorry, but there's always more to do. I'm just trying to add something at each level. Yes?
So I'm going to take the last question, and we've used the word discrimination a lot.
Yes.
Does the book talk about persecution or some sort of range of levels of intensity of discrimination?
Well, like I said, I have a measure where each minority is assigned a score of 0 to theoretically 70, so we do have that. I define as discrimination, not persecution, because persecution generally can mean a specific minority, or it could be in general to everybody. I do discuss that in theory a little bit in the book, in the distinct, because I do have a brief discussion in this book, much briefer than I have in my in one of my earlier books. And I apologize. The book where I actually discuss the different definitions of religious freedom is actually a book called The Unfree Exercise of Religion. I have a chapter on that there, but the general analysis I talked about is in the political secularism book. This is book number 13. I write a lot of books. So I talk about how it's conceived, but at the end of the day, I'm measuring what I'm measuring, and that's what I'm discussing. So, like I said, it's not everything. There's more I could have done. There are things that are left out, and I'm pretty open about that. But again, I feel I've bit off about as much as I can chew in one book.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please help me in thanking our speaker. Well, just in conclusion, a couple of quick things. First, Jonathan, thank you for a fascinating talk. And we have quite a number of students in the room, so let me just say to them and to faculty, it's interesting to see the arc of a career where there's this set of building blocks, 13 books in this large trajectory making a huge impact. And I congratulate you on that. A second thing I'd like to draw to your attention is a brochure that has his biographical information and the book information on it, but it also has ways to connect with the Religious Freedom Institute. And so I urge you to sign up for our mailing list, for our newsletter list, and for our social media right there. And as we conclude today, let me simply say that this brings to an end our fall series of programming with speakers, but all of the fall programming is available on our website and our YouTube channel, and I hope that you'll avail yourselves of that. So that concludes today's program. Again, Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you.